Hello, everyone. Welcome to History 202 lecture. This is the first of our online lectures for the semester. I will post these a couple of times throughout the semester, especially if we get behind like we are right now. So today we're looking at Chapter 23, Creoles um, and Caudillos, Latin America and the Caribbean in the 19th century. So we've spent some time talking about revolutions of the Atlantic world, particularly the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution. And as we can imagine, this revolutionary spirit is continuing to develop throughout the um, the 19th century as well. So, what we see happening in societies and colonies, rather, all around the South America, is that these colonies that have belonged to mostly parts of Spain, but also other European countries, particularly Portugal, that colonized Brazil. Most of the other ones, however, are colonized by the Spanish. These Spanish colonies began independence movements. So, just like the British colonists in North America, they are going to argue for their independence from Spanish rule. Um, we see many of these independence movements led by Creoles, people from mixed racial ancestry. If you remember from our class earlier, Creole is defined by someone who can trace their ancestry back to Africa, Europe, and Native America. So Creoles are a large population in Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and we really see these independence movements happening in all of these different places. So here is Uruguay, independence movement here, Paraguay right here, and it just keeps going. Okay. Independence movements continue to develop throughout South America, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Panama. Now we see independence movements in all of these places. However, there are not as many Creole people in these movements. We would call the majority of these movements led by Europeans. Um, so that's one of the differences that's going on throughout the continent. Is the demographics making up the revolutionaries. One specific man who became synonymous with independence movements in South America is Simon Bolivar. Um, and he did include the enslaved and Creoles and a rather diverse population of people in his movements, and he became quite successful at it. So there became tension within different former colonies struggling to become free, between Creoles and what are known as pardons. In terms of sort of control of the political sphere. So here is a picture of a painting about Simon Bolivar. Again, he had the nickname the Liberator, and he helped to lead revolutionary movements in Colombia, in what will be Bolivia, named after him, Panama, and other parts of northern South America. Now, as you can see, he is depicted very much as white or European, and the Spanish Empire had married into the Habsburg Empire in Europe. There was this link between the Spanish, the French, and the Austrian Empire all through marriage. Um, so there is going to be these very defined class elements within the revolutionaries of revolutions of the of South America. Okay, but as you can see, right, going back to the painting, um, he is depicted as European. Obviously, he is depicted here liberating enslaved people out of slavery. And of course, there would have been enslaved Africans in all parts of South America because of the slave trade, and certainly Brazil as well. But the population of South America is one that it was mostly Creole. Um, People are tracing their ancestry back to all three places. All right. Now, in independence movements in Northern South America, again, we have a different set of the population. You have a lot of ethnic and political struggles in terms of government weakness. You also have a lot of money that's spent into these independence movements. One specific place that we can also look at in terms of how they gained their independence from Spain is, of course, Mexico. Um, Mexican independence against Spain is led predominantly by land owning Creoles. There is a uprising against Spain that begins in 1810 by Miguel Hidalgo Castillo. Um, and he is going to be one of the revolutionaries that becomes synonymous with Mexican independence. He is captured, he is ultimately executed, but the war for independence continues until 1821. Um, there is a compromise that somewhat ends this Mexican independence movement, and even a sort of movement to create a Mexican empire. But that doesn't last very long. All right. Here is a famous painting that helps to depict the struggle for Mexican independence against the Spanish, painted by Diego Rivera, who spends a lot of time in his art depicting Mexican history. He's Mexican. In northern Mexico, we would have found numerous nomadic tribes of indigenous Americans, one of them being the Comanches. The Comanche tribe of Native Americans was located throughout northern Mexico as well as throughout the American Southwest, particularly Texas, or what will become Texas. Um, as Mexico became independent from Spain, the Spanish in charge, or sorry, the newly formed Mexican government does not know what to do with Comanches. Um, they are nomadic people, so they are not sedentary, they are not agriculturalists, they move from place to place. Um, they also raid towns because their other form of how they used to survive, which was first just being nomadic herders and then becoming horse traders, they no longer can do this. So they basically raid different towns for what they need and continue to be nomadic that way. Um, when the Mexican government is created in these rather firm boundaries now, or so they thought, firm boundaries between Mexico and what will be the United States are drawn, the Mexican government does support immigration um, from the U.S. to create this buffer with them. Um, as the U.S. grows, however, the U.S. is continuously bumping into Mexico. So Mexico at this time is very, very large, much larger than it is now. Um, Mexico at this point would have, let me see if there's a picture, right, would have gone all the way into Northern California. So what you see here in this map is a great indication of where the Comanche Indians were located. So again, the green area is what will be Mexico. However, all of this was considered Mexico as Mexico became independent from Spain. All right, so they don't really know what to do with these nomadic people. And at the same time that they are this newly formed independent country, the U.S. is growing bigger, and now the U.S. Is bumping up against them. So, a couple of things to know about the U.S. Mexican War is we've spent some time talking about the American War of Independence. So, that happens in 1776, goes on for a few years. We have a secure nation, constitutionally speaking. Um, and we will have another war with England. I know we didn't talk about this in class, but there is another war with England that happens in 1812. Um, and England tries to reclaim its colony. It goes to war basically on the sea with American ships over slavery, among other things, but mostly slavery and the slave trade. Um, so also, I mentioned this in class today. The French occupied the middle part of North America, and they sell that to the United States in 1803 to help get money, obviously, because again, France is in a financial jam. So they sell their colony to the U.S. That's known as Louisiana Purchase. And after that, we see massive settlement into this area. Now, keep in mind that when Mexico becomes independent from Spain, the new Mexican government outlaws slavery. Slavery is forbidden in Mexico. So, one of the issues that's causing the U.S. Mexican War is that white Southerners are moving into Texas. Texas, of course, being part of Mexico. And they're bringing their slaves with them. There is continuous fighting along this border between white settlers and local Mexicans, as well as Comanche Indians, over access to this territory, which is incredibly fertile agricultural space. Um, these whites are going to claim that it's Texas, the state of Texas, and then belongs to the United States. The local people are going to claim it's theirs. The Comanche Indians are also claiming it's theirs. So you have all of this going on in the U.S. Mexican War. All right. So um, we will see the U.S. Declare war on Mexico in the late 1840s. It's a rather long war, very unpopular, but nonetheless, the U.S. wins, and unexpectedly. And in this, then all of this territory is ceded to the U.S. So this is what Mexico will become after the Mexican American War. You get not only Texas, but New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado. Um, so basically, a third of the U.S. Is is handed over from Mexico. So, what about all the people that live there? Well, the people who live here, right? Interestingly enough, if you are a land owning person, Mexican American, you'll get to vote. If you don't, you will not. Which is in direct contrast to how the Constitution defines land ownership. All right. Um, what we see happening in Mexico following the Mexican American War is that you have a lot of sort of European or white influence on Mexico. Um, the French are still very involved in Mexico as well. There is a lot, again, even in this period of intermarriage between sort of the ruling families in Mexico and European empires in Europe. Um, so there is this interesting culture that is developing there that is very much Creole in scope. All right. Um, throughout the early period of Mexican history, Mexico is becoming stable. It's becoming industrial, but it's also ruled in an authoritarian way. And one example of this is Mexico under Diaz, who is going to basically lead his country as a dictator, and in so doing, alienating a lot of people. This type of alienation is going to result in a revolution against the government by other Mexicans in 1910, which was an anti-Diaz uprising. This one is led by Pancho Villa, and this very much is similar to the French Revolution. This is a lower class rebellion, um, and against the landed gentry, the landed aristocracy. All right, let's see. Now, all right, what comes out of this is that Pancho Villa and others wanted and argued for total economic change. They really wanted land reform as the central issue. They wanted to, similar to, I guess, North America and the French Revolution, they wanted to establish a merit-based society. They wanted a more equitable society. They wanted a more racially inclusive society, and they wanted a change in constitution, um, where the people of the lower class could have much more economic opportunities. And that's what the Mexican Revolution of 1910 does. So it takes a while before Mexico has, or rather similar to the US, it has its revolution, and then 50, 60 years down the line, it basically has a civil war, the same way we see happening in the US. All right. Um, Brazil has an interesting legacy as well. As you remember, Brazil is the place that imports and brings in more enslaved Africans than any other destination in the Western Hemisphere. Um, just like the other colonies of South America, Brazil is going to break away from Portugal in 1822 to become an independent country. It does not develop a constitutional government, but rather becomes an independent monarchy, or a country ruled by a king. Um, by this point in time, coffee had begun to replace sugar as its main export. The coffee phase of Brazilian history is responsible for bringing in more enslaved Africans than any other period of Brazilian history. Um, Slavery, race based slavery in Brazil, isn't abolished until 1888. So that's about 25 years after America. Um, excuse me. Not only had slavery at this point been around for hundreds of years, there is an incredibly racially diverse population in Brazil. It continues to sort of be known throughout the world for its racial diversity, and that history is very much the product of both African slavery as well as sort of steady stream of European immigrants coming in during this time. Those slaves that have been emancipated by 1888 have no land, they have no education, they have no job training. What we see in the U.S. following the end of slavery is a period known as Reconstruction, where there is an attempt by some in Congress to provide immediate needs for newly freed people, such as land, education, and job training. But as we see here in Brazil, there is no mechanism within the monarchical government that allows for this. So this is an interesting point of comparison between the U.S. and Brazil. Okay. At the same time, landowners were encouraged to bring in immigrants, as I was saying, before to replace slave labor. So we have this very large former enslaved population that is now free, that are darker skinned. They are sort of African in scope, and at the same time, we have also a very large European population of immigrants. You have a population of Creoles. You have a population of biracial people as well. So again, Brazil becomes incredibly racially diverse. When we look at Latin American societies and economy in the 19th century, again, what we find is a very interesting place, and a place that is has gone through these revolutions similar to America and the French Revolution, but has many of them refusing to, or rather choosing not to have the same level of reforms. Um, what we see happening economically is that basically throughout the 19th century, trade with Europe is sort of radically disrupted, and is disrupted for a number of reasons. It's disrupted by independence movements, it's disrupted by a change in commodities, and it's disrupted by revolutionaries in some way, and by an unwillingness of European countries to really interact with new revolutionary governments. So there are some countries that very much prospered from this. England being a country that prospered from sort of the larger trade network. England was the sort of central power of the Atlantic world. As I said before, it was the strongest empire in the 19th century. It was the largest, and it had what is considered to be the best military. That doesn't mean they won every war. They also tried to colonize Haiti and take over during the Haitian Revolution and fail. Um, so there were certainly limits, but they would have been considered the main power of the Atlantic world. In most of the wars of independence and revolutionary movements of Latin America, they are led by Creoles. Um, so Creoles played a very large role in shaping the revolutionary landscape and the creation of new governments following successful rebellions and revolutions. Um, Many of these places, however, sort of remained agricultural. So we see an embrace of industrialism in Mexico, but most of these countries will remain sort of agriculturally specific and economic and very politically conservative, and not become competitive on a global market in terms of industrialization. Um, okay. So this is what the map of South America looks like in the after 1900 or the 20th century. So just for a second, let's look back. Here, this is what South America looked like in 1831. So right at the beginning of the sort of revolutionary century, right? So these are all Spanish colonies, former Spanish colonies that are becoming um, new and independent. And then this is where these lines are going to be by 1900. So all of this has been consolidated. What was once separate kingdoms have all been consolidated into one large country. That's Argentina. You have Uruguay here, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela. These British and French countries right here, still claiming a little bit of territory, and a free and independent Brazil, no longer a part of Portugal. You can also see how by the early 20th century, again, so much agriculturally is produced both in the Caribbean and Central America, as well as throughout um, South America as well. All right. One of the things that we also see happening in the 19th century are many of these new republics wanted to limit the power of the Catholic Church. Um, this was very difficult because many of these revolutionaries were inspired and by or saw themselves as being good Catholics. So this was also difficult. It's hard to sort of embrace progressive ideas in that context. All right. Again, as I said before, the economy of most of these new countries are going to remain agricultural, so they are just producing the raw economy. The raw materials. Um, Again, not having a very diverse or industrial workforce. Um, when there is an industrial revolution, it's going to come a little bit later. And there will only be a few that are able to keep up with sort of the global economy, for lack of a better phrase. All right. So we can look a little bit more at this in Latin American society in the 19th century. There was also a high demand for labor. So when we look at sort of the global implications of these revolutionary movements in South America, we find that they are also going to receive a lot of immigrants. Um, Immigrants not only from Europe, but also from China and Australia and Japan. So we see the sort of movement of people within the Pacific Rim also coming to these other places, including the Caribbean. Um, their labor shortages did not lead to improved wages because of racist policies. There were a lot of workers, but racism very much divided workers and labor unions, and many people, again, had sort of religiously conservative ideas, which often prevented a common economic goal. So, generally speaking, when we think of the South American economy and Latin America, right? So, Latin America um, is refers to not only the Spanish speaking world, but also the French and the Portuguese, people who speak a variety of language, not just Spanish. Little industrialization is happening before World War One. All right. For the most part, what we would find in these South American nation states is that the status of women remain fairly low. And again, that's sort of to be expected in places that are conservative and very religious. There tends to be a low status of women. Um, there was very much a encouraging patriarchal society over families. The church sort of dominated and enforced the idea that men were superior and controlled their families. Um, there was this idea of sort of separate spheres, that women had their sphere and men had their sphere, and women certainly were not really wanted or included in public space. Now, widows, single women had a certain level of autonomy, a certain level of freedom, but married women were really not allowed to have any sort of public life. There was certainly the expectation of a woman being dutiful to her husband and child, and that being sort of the extent of her social network. Okay, so this is the end of the lecture. You might look at some of these paintings. Again, if you were choosing revolutions of the Atlantic world, or African slavery, or even resistance, you might choose something like this as a primary source. But we would certainly find any slave society, of course, that existed in the Western Hemisphere. Um, would have seen slave rebellions, and slave rebellions of course, occurred on ship. They have occurred in all places in the Western Hemisphere, as people will always resist enslavement. All right, so please let me know if you have any questions.